His book is Civilization. It sold 12 copies. We welcome Niall Ferguson. How's it doing?
13 copies last time.
13 copies. How is it doing? I mean, you spend 3 months all squirreled away in some castle somewhere in northern Scotland writing up this book,
it were as few
and you
as
throw
3.
the baby out. How does this compare to all your other books so far?
I think it's going well. I think it's going well because this is the right time to be asking the big question. What has gone wrong with Western civilization? We're watching Europe crash and burn.
Right.
I think I got the timing right. I was good with The Ascent of Money, which came out when Lehman was crashing and burning.
Yeah.
That was a question about the financial system. This is bigger. Something profound is wrong with the Western system. And although it's bad in Europe now, what worries me is that some of those problems we're seeing in Europe could cross the Atlantic. And that's been my preoccupation for some time, as you know.
My favorite book of continental Europe is Jerry Muller of Catholic University, the great Adam Smith scholar. His wonderful book on Germanic capitalism, the culture that brought us to Merkel, the Bundesbank, even forgetting about wheelbarrows of money after World War I. What is it unique about the Germanic character now that everybody in Europe's struggling with?
Well, if you think back a whole long way, 100 years or so, many people worried then that German economic might was going to lead to dominance of Europe. 2 world wars later, by peaceful means, they seem to be getting there. And that's making a lot of people in Europe very nervous indeed. Because after all, what really are they discussing tomorrow? They're discussing whether the German government can impose fiscal controls on the rest of Europe.
What's your prediction?
I'm not optimistic at this point. I mean, I think the ECB went off at half-cock today with Mr. Draghi. That's one reason the markets are down.
This is a different ECB, isn't it?
It is. And
it's way different.
It is, and it's long overdue different. Right. But, you know, they have to do a lot more than they've done so far to stabilize the European bond market, not to mention the European banking system. And I have to say, I don't have much faith in the politicians. How many of these Euro summits have we seen? Some kind of thing will come out tomorrow, but in the end, they are a long way from an agreement on what they have to do.
Too much information. Let's bring it up here. This chart surprised me. I knew this, but it's shocking to see. This is the spirit of Europe. I've editorialized there a bit. France overall confidence. And it's just remarkable how it's well below 0 and it's just rolled over into a lethargy. How do you instill growth within the Eurosclerosis, that word from another time? How do you bring the Valéry Giscard d'Estaing spirit, the Helmut Schmidt spirit, back into Europe?
That's what Nicolas Sarkozy was supposed to do, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But, you know, these are profound structural problems that lie behind the sovereign debt crisis. The sovereign debt crisis is in many ways just part of a banking crisis, which is, frankly, as bad as anything we saw in the United States in 08, 09, maybe even worse. Behind that, you have a fundamental crisis of competitiveness. The German core really is more competitive than the Mediterranean periphery. That's one profound reason for the trouble that we're seeing. And I think the lack of confidence is understandable when all the politicians have in response to these problems is austerity. In other words, we're going to have a balanced budget, come what may. That's become the German official line, not just a sort of 3% limit, but balanced budgets as a mandatory obligation for members of the European Monetary Union. I mean, that is not going to work, Tom, let's face it.
Your wonderful Warbird book about someone that most Americans don't know, the European social contract that came out of Europe, 2 wars, the Atlantic Charter, the development of GATT, that European social contract, is it broken?
Yes, it is broken. It was based on not only a deal between capital and labour, which always worked better in Germany than elsewhere after World War II, but it was also based on a deal between the generations, really. The welfare state was established to provide care from the cradle to the grave in most countries on a far more generous basis than in the United States. The demographics are killing the welfare states all over Europe, and by the way, Germany is not exempt from this. And I think that's really the root of the matter. 12 years ago, Larry Kotlikoff and I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs predicting what we called the degeneration of EMU, the degeneration of the monetary union, because of the fundamental impasse, the blockage between generational change, the aging populations, and these post-war welfare states, which are basically bankrupt.
If you're sitting in a classroom at Harvard looking at Western Civ 101 off your book Civilization, what is the message to students that's not being discussed in Europe?
Well, one of my students actually asked me at the end of the semester, what does this mean for our generation? And I said, well, it means that you shouldn't expect your lives to be a whole lot like the last generation. You better be planning for a different future. If you look, for example...
A lesser future?
Well, possibly a different geographical location for your future. One of the points that I've made recently, which applies to the US as much as to Europe, is that if you look at the quality of our legal institutions, our rule of law, which after all is the foundation for a successful market economy, there's a marked deterioration that we're dealing with here. And it's not just about over-complex regulation. If you just take the measures that the World Economic Forum does for the quality of the rule of law, it's striking how poorly the United States fares. I mean, admittedly, European countries are even worse, but Hong Kong is up there in the top 10 on most measures of the quality of the rule of law. So my message to the students was, go east, young men and women.
Lord Skidelsky, who Niall Ferguson has studied for years, as I have, the great Keynes biographer, a recent op-ed, The Wages of Economic Ignorance. The Eurozone must be recognized as a failed experiment. It should be reconstituted with far fewer members, including only countries that do not persist current account deficits. Can Europe really happen with a core Europe? And I'm sorry, that's Deutsche Mark 150, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's one reason that I don't wholly buy the idea that this thing is going to be dismantled. I was a strong opponent of creating a single currency 12 years ago, unlike many people who today are predicting its breakup, including the Financial Times and The Economist, all staunch pro-monetary union organs in the late 90s.
Right.
But now that we've created this thing, it's extremely hard to dismantle. Even if you kicked the Greeks out, the contagion effect for Portugal or Spain or Italy would be very negative. The Germans don't gain from dismantling this. It's really going to hurt them to go back to the Deutschmark. So I still think, I haven't wholly given up hope that they'll see reason and avoid a complete meltdown.
Great. Come back tomorrow. Neil Ferguson, thanks so much.
With
Harvard University. The book is Civilization.